The Commission will come to order, and good morning to everybody. Thank you for being here for this hearing on the Commission on Security Cooperation in Europe, Human Trafficking and Transnational Organized Crime, Assessing Trends in Combat Strategies. This morning we'll be talking about human trafficking, as we have done so often in the past on this Commission. In 1998, some of you may know, I introduced the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and not long after that chaired this Commission's first hearing on human trafficking. At that time, the idea that human trafficking even existed was widespread was met with a wall of skepticism and opposition. People, whether in government or not, thought the bold new strategy of the TPVA, although we had a different name for it then, we finally added that name near the end of the process, but they thought that shelter, asylum, and other protections for victims, long jail sentences, and asset confiscation for the traffickers, and tough sanctions for governments that fail to meet minimum standards were merely a solution in search of a problem. Today, few would deny that the scourge of human trafficking, though often hidden, is in fact very widespread. Back in the 1990s, the term trafficking was applied almost exclusively to illicit drugs or weapons. Reports of vulnerable persons, especially women and children, being reduced to objects for sale were met with surprise, incredulity, or indifference. It took 2 years to educate people, especially in the U.S. House and Senate, to muster the votes for passage of the legislation. Today, as we explore the links between transnational organized crime and trafficking, I'd like to start by pointing out that there is a new frontier in the fight against human trafficking. Years ago, human traffickers were not highly organized and were not typically connected to gangs that were involved in other kinds of organized crime. This is less and less true today, and we need to consider how methods of fighting human trafficking need to adapt. We know that human trafficking, or modern-day slavery, is the third most lucrative criminal activity in the world. According to the International Labor Organization, ILO, human traffickers made profits in excess of $31 billion a year. It is not surprising that more and more organized criminal groups are engaging in modern-day slavery. And, of course, while drug and arms traffickers have a commodity that can be sold only once, human traffickers can purchase a slave and continually exploit that individual until he makes his money back and then some, and obviously it is very, very lucrative. This is a complex subject. It is marked by the growing ingenuity of organized criminal groups, the difficulty of knowing what or who passes over increasingly porous borders, and the gang's use of modern technologies. All this has obscured the activities of many syndicates and made learning about fighting their activities very difficult. Yet it is not impossible and simply has to be done because so many vulnerable people, so many lives are at stake. I'd like to conclude with one very important point, the premise that must shape how we approach the fight against transnational organized crime as it diversifies its operations into human trafficking. Human beings are more important than drugs and guns. Of course, our allocation of effort and resources which investigate and our prosecutorial strategies need to reflect this. This needs to be the highest possible priority. Today we are joined by a panel of experts on transnational organized crime and human trafficking who will shed the light on current patterns and countermeasures. Their combined expertise should paint a clearer picture of organized crime's involvement in human trafficking and what can be done to help to stop it. With us today is Mr. Greg Andres, the current Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Crime Division, where he supervises the organized crime section at the Department of Justice. Mr. Andres comes to us with over a decade of experience working on organized crime issues. We will then be joined by Mr. Pierro Bonado, Deputy Representative for the UN Office on Drugs and Crime in New York. Mr. Bonado's testimony will bring the UNODC's years of experience in combating transnational organized crime. And finally, we will have Ms. Martina Vandenberg, a seasoned attorney with years of experience in combating trafficking in persons, as well as in broader human rights context of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, and the Russian Federation and Uzbekistan, all of which have significant human trafficking histories and problems and are of great interest to our Commission. Mr. Greg Andres, I'd like to now turn the floor to you for your comments.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Smith. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you this morning about the threat posed by human trafficking and transnational organized crime, the efforts the Department of Justice is taking to address those threats, and the steps that Congress can take that will assist us in those efforts. The fight against transnational organized crime is one of the highest enforcement priorities of the Department of Justice. Together with the United States Attorney's Office and our many partners in law enforcement, the Criminal Division investigates and prosecutes cases involving transnational organized crime all over the country, indeed all over the world. The threats posed by these groups are significant and growing.
Mr. Andrews, if you could just suspend for what, and I apologize for the rudeness of the intervention, but there's a markup in the Foreign Affairs Committee that I must be at. Two bills are going to be voted on right now. Thankfully, Senator Mark Rubio is here and will take the chair. And when you conclude his statement, he will give his statement. And I do thank you for your understanding.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thanks, Mr. Marcus.
Welcome. I don't get to chair a lot of things around here, so please continue. Thank you.
Good morning, Commissioner Rubio. In recognition of the issues with respect to transnational organized crime, in July, the administration released its strategy to combat transnational organized crime, which sets forth a whole-of-government response to the threat. At the Department of Justice, we are committed to the fight against transnational organized crime and human trafficking, and we have enjoyed successes to date as to both. In the area of human trafficking, the Department last month secured the racketeering convictions of two brothers who ran a human trafficking scheme. That scheme involved smuggling young Ukrainian immigrants into the United States and forcing them to work without pay through threats and assault, sexual abuse, and debt bondage. Roughly 6 months earlier, in May of this year, in a separate case, a Quebec national was sentenced to 12 years in prison after he pled guilty to racketeering conspiracy, which charged a scheme to recruit and exploit dozens of workers from Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, the Philippines, and elsewhere, and forced those individuals to work in hospitality jobs in at least 14 states through threats of deportation and financial penalties. Many of our human trafficking cases involve loosely affiliated networks of individuals engaged in the exploitation of human trafficking victims. These criminals tend to utilize smuggling pipelines and money laundering conduits operated by other criminal groups and whose services the traffickers procure for their own purposes. On occasion, human traffickers themselves belong to a larger organized crime group or enterprise. In some cases, criminals may operate transnationally, recruiting victims overseas with false promises, good jobs in the United States, and threatening retaliation against their overseas families if they try to escape once they realize their true predicament. To the extent that these networks or groups are committing portions of their crimes abroad, our investigations and prosecutions of these organizations and crimes must overcome significant obstacles. At a minimum, pursuing an investigation abroad is often time-consuming, and delays can be significant. These delays can undermine our investigations. Tracking down criminals abroad often requires the cooperation of foreign law enforcement agencies. Furthermore, even if we locate our targets, many of the investigative tools for gathering evidence are not available to us in the international context. In many countries, we cannot employ Title III type wiretaps against perpetrators or secure routine surveillance, nor can we, in most cases, send an undercover agent to gather incriminating statements. Sometimes the country's law enforcement agencies may not have the level of training or the technology to implement the necessary investigative steps, even if they are authorized to do so. Arresting lower-level members of the organization and persuading them to cooperate against higher-level bosses is also extremely difficult and may require the approval and cooperation of foreign authorities. Finally, many countries have laws which ban the extradition of their own citizens to foreign countries for prosecution. There are important steps that we can take to better address extraterritorial threats and the increasingly global reach of transnational criminal organizations. The Department of Justice, together with our partners, have developed a package of legislative proposals to ensure that federal laws keep us up with the rapid evolution of organized criminal activity. We need to change our existing money laundering, asset forfeiture, narcotics, and racketeering laws. Additional proposals recognize that in an increasingly global law enforcement environment, witness security and the protection of foreign witnesses must also be available. This last provision may be of particular help in situations where a foreign government is helping us to prosecute an international human trafficking ring, but is unable to protect its witnesses. I'm happy to discuss these proposals and to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and I'll couch my question in the form of the opening statement. First, to thank you for being here and all those who are here to testify and be a part of this hearing on this important issue. I'm grateful to the chairman and the co-chairman for allowing us to hold these hearings, and on what I think is a shocking issue that I was not fully aware of before I got here, and although I had heard about it, I think many Americans are unaware of the extent to which this issue impacts our country and the world. We tend to think of slavery as something that happened 150 years ago or 200 years ago or in other places, but we don't realize that even here today in the United States there are people that are being held against their will. Obviously, we will talk a little bit about sexual exploitation, but there's also all kinds of other elements to this, including forced labor and domestic servitude, and we've seen those stories and the kind of the parameters that are pretty broad in terms of what qualifies as human slavery that exists to this day. I appreciate the work that you guys do on these issues. This is a cutting-edge issue that I think we have an opportunity to create awareness on, because, and I think in our questions we'll get to some of that. I think public awareness of the existence of this will help us identify domestic victims, and I think internationally our country has taken the lead in terms of the role we've played in classifying countries' compliance in the tier system has taken the lead in terms of calling attention to this human rights issue. And one of the things that always adds to our nation is when we are strong spokespersons on behalf of human rights all over the world, and I can think of no issue that has a higher priority or should have a higher priority than the issue of trafficking in people and human slavery. So with that, a couple questions that I have. I think the first is, you talked a little bit about obviously the Department of Justice has a long history of prosecuting organized crime cases. This human trafficking element is kind of a relatively new component of how we are approaching these organized crime organizations. How has that forced you to, and I think you talked about it a little bit in your statement, but how has that forced you to alter how you strategize with regards to interacting with these groups? I mean, what new dynamics does it present from the traditional activities that that organized crime has largely been linked to, trafficking in drugs, et cetera? And second of all, what is the law caught up with the realities of what it takes to prosecute, whether it's how hard it is to get witnesses or reliable information, those sorts of things? I mean, I guess the basic question I have is, this is a kind of a new problem that you're facing as you confront these organized crime operations, and organized crime itself has changed as well. Are our laws up to date with the 21st century realities of prosecuting organized crime, in particular when it comes to the trafficking of people?
Thank you, Commissioner Rubio. One thing that's certainly clear about organized crime, and organized crime, even traditional Cosa Nostra domestic organized crime organizations have traditionally evolved rather significantly over the last decades. The abiding principle of organized crime groups is they exist for the purpose of making money, period. And the fact that human trafficking is an opportunity to generate additional revenues certainly makes it alluring to organized crime groups, both here in the United States and internationally. So even as we've seen when we've prosecuted domestically the mob, we've seen they've changed from tactics like murder and extortion to now being involved in white-collar crimes or Wall Street. So we're certainly used to the changing nature of organized crime and the fact that it adapts as we adapt our law enforcement strategies. There is an international component here. It's not the only component, but there is an international component here. And our laws do need to be updated to address those international concerns. When you talk about investigating cases internationally, you have to start with cooperation by foreign governments. That's essential. In some of these countries where there is trafficking and organized crime influence, we don't always have the cooperation of those governments. There's corruption in many of those places, and so there are difficulties with respect to that issue. On the legislative front, and briefly, we need to update our racketeering laws so that international organized crime groups that are operating abroad and don't have as many touches, physical touches to the United States, but that are affecting the United States, that we can prosecute those groups. We need to update our money laundering laws so that we can attack not only the organizations, but also their money and their use of the United States financial system to launder their money. We need to update our witness protection provisions, which allow us to secure witnesses who may be involved in prosecutions abroad, and that are helping foreign governments convict and prosecute these enterprises abroad. So we do need to update our laws. Let me just finish by saying we have had successes, and we have been concentrating on this issue. I think the administration's strategy on transnational organized crime is another effort to highlight the problem of human trafficking. But you should be confident that the prosecutors in the Department of Justice, primarily in the Civil Rights Division, have taken an active role in prosecuting these cases. And if I could just give you one example as it relates to Mexico. Since 2009, our prosecutors have been working, along with the agents in the FBI and ICE, have been working collaboratively with Mexican law enforcement officials on arrests, convictions, both here in the United States and Mexico. We've helped to rescue victims as part of this bilateral cooperation, reunify U.S. victims with their families, returning them from Mexico. We've had success with prosecutions here in the United States, both in Atlanta, in the United States versus Ruggiero, and also in Miami in United States versus Cortez Castro. So we do have working relationships with foreign governments. That is a vital part of this strategy because so much of the evidence, as it relates to international organized crime, exists abroad.
In terms of the witnesses, the victims, is the current structure and nature of our immigration system make it easier for these crimes to happen? In essence, how is the existing immigration structure, the complicated visa processes, what have you, the existing lack thereof or existence of a for lack of a better term, the guest worker program. It's not really a guest worker program, but that's how it really functions as. The way our system, our visa program is currently structured today, does it make it harder to prosecute these cases? And more importantly, does it actually have the traffickers actually figured out how to use the system to their benefit?
I think that the latter is important here. That is, traffickers have used that to exploit the system and to lure people basically here to the United States. So through use of the internet or other means to publicize this, those who are interested in committing the crime of human trafficking.
Explain to me briefly how they use the system as it's currently structured. How do they use the current visa system to get people in the country and then kind of trap them here, right?
Sure, they allure them here under the guise of getting a guest worker visa or some other type visa that they may apply for. And once they get here, they then exploit those individuals. Obviously, a lot of the human trafficking problem preys on the vulnerability of people here in the United States, whether it's a vulnerability because they're not from the United States, they don't have families and relatives here, they don't know the system, they don't know the laws. So traffickers are able to lure them here to the United States and then basically enslave them to do a variety of different things, whether it's involved in the sex trade or it's involved as laborers. They basically lure them here and then entrap them once they have them here and are able to control their lives.
Their visas are linked to a specific employer, right? Basically, whoever it is they brought them in to work for?
I believe that's true, but I don't know that specifically, but we certainly could look into that, Senator, and get back to you as to how that's.
In terms of once you find a victim or a witness or both, how hard is it to get them to cooperate if, for example, depending on their status in the country, their fear of family abroad, and what kind of measures have you looked at? Because one of the things I've read about is once you identify a victim, the victim is probably very insecure about their own status, their own ability, kind of where they stand on this whole thing and where it's going to lead them. What's your sense of how hard has it been to get victims to become witnesses, to become reliable witnesses and to cooperative ones as a result of two things? Number one is their status or their fear, and number two is maybe their family abroad.
So let me say two things. One, one distinction with respect to dealing with victims in human trafficking cases are they certainly have different status, that is, having gone through the ordeal of being a victim in those cases, there are additional challenges that we have to deal with. I think our law enforcement partners in the FBI and ICE and other agencies have developed an expertise in dealing with those victims. As for cooperating, again, that's not new to us. That's not a new struggle for people who've been involved in prosecuting organized crime cases. Obviously, when we've done it domestically, whether it's an MS-13 gang or the Gambino family, there are always individuals who are afraid of retaliation by those organized crime groups. That's why things like the Witness Protection Program have been a vital part of our fight against organized crime, and there is a new proposal that will extend that internationally. So we can use some of the tools that we already have and have been using to fight organized crime in the context of human trafficking to provide a safe and secure location for people so that they can have the confidence to go into court and testify against those involved in these crimes.
I think my last question is with regards to the groups that are actually conducting this. Obviously, the transnational, the big groups with the brand names, the other ones we know a lot about. But there's some emerging evidence of some smaller scale groups, for lack of a better term, mom and pop family-run operations that are a handful of family. I mean, I've read anecdotally, maybe I'm wrong, but I've read anecdotally there's a number of smaller scale operations where it's really 3 or 4 people. How do they present a different challenge in prosecuting and identifying, number one, and number two is, is there a specific kind of trafficking that they're more involved in than, say, the bigger transnational groups?
There is no question that there's a change in organized crime, both domestically and internationally, that there are emerging groups, that there are smaller groups. They don't necessarily have household names. Luckily, under our racketeering laws, you don't have to have a name or be a recognized group to be charged under racketeering, because we can charge you as being an association, in fact. So if there are a group of individuals, even if it's a family organization or a family group, we can charge them together as an enterprise. Some of the legislative proposals that we have add state law crimes of slavery and other related human trafficking offenses as RICO predicates, so we're able to attack them with our racketeering laws. So the updates in the law will address that. And again, I'm not sure that there are some different challenges, but to the extent that we can use our racketeering laws, that's helpful. And again, we have had some success in doing that. Our civil rights prosecutors have been working with our organized crime prosecutors to bring RICO cases. There was recently a series of brothers who were charged in Philadelphia with importing victims, and we were able to charge what was basically a family-run operation with importing victims for the purposes of human trafficking. So again, we do need to update our laws, but some of the past strategies that we've used for organized crime, we're able to adapt those together with the new legislation that we believe will be able to be successful in prosecuting these groups.
Thank you very much for your time today and your testimony. We appreciate it. Thank you. I guess our next witness is a Mr. Pierro Bonado. How are you? I'll give you a few minutes to set up.
Hi.
Thank you for coming today.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting UNODC and for allowing us to bring some international perspective to these important discussions. On behalf of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, my sincere thanks to the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe for inviting me to speak. The cooperation spirit of the Commission, as well as the one of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, has often supported the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime and the United Nations Global Initiative to fight human trafficking. Human trafficking is a truly global phenomenon and a crime which affects nearly every part of the world, whether as a source, transit, or destination country. According to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime Human Trafficking Report released in 2009, victims from at least 127 countries have been identified, and this is estimated that more than 2.4 million people are being exploited by criminals at any given time. More than a decade after the adoption of the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in person, especially women and children, supplementing the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, the Palermo Convention, the largest majority of countries have criminalized most forms of human trafficking in their legislation. Nevertheless, the use of such laws to prosecute and convict traffickers remains limited. In 2009 Global Report on Trafficking in Person, for instance, 2 out of every 5 countries covered in the report had never recorded a single conviction for human trafficking offenses. The demand of trafficking victims, especially those related to sexual exploitation, remains high, particularly in Europe. According to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, Organized Crime Threat Assessment, the majority of the victims detected in Europe come from the Balkans and the former Soviet Union, including countries such as Romania, Bulgaria, Ukraine, the Russian Federation, and the Republic of Moldova. With regard to victims originating in South America, mostly from Brazil, they are being sent to destinations such as Spain, Italy, Portugal, France, the Netherlands, Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. African victims are sourced mainly in West Africa, although North African victims seem to be increasing. Finally, Asian victims are mainly originating in Thailand. Most recently, Chinese, Vietnamese, and Cambodian victims are also increasing. Traffickers remain using deception and coercion as the main instrument to recruit victims. As a recent trend, women seem not to be only involved in recruiting other women, but also playing the role of guardians in the countries of destination of victims. Another trend is that in the case of Europe, the perpetrators are frequently not nationals of the country where they operate, but often national of the same countries as their victims. Distinguished Commissioner, cooperation is fundamental to combat the exploitation of women, children, and men by human traffickers. Let's start with the outcome of our own efforts to gather information from member states. Trafficking in persons for forced labor is the second most reported form of exploitation. But we share with all of you a concern that this form of trafficking is less frequently detected and reported than trafficking in persons for sexual exploitation. Labor trafficking just until recently was started to be taken into consideration by the work community. Prosecution and criminalization of this particular type of trafficking also needs to be set in practice. UNODC is helping to shine a powerful light on this crime. Working with others, in particular the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, we are developing clear strategies to meet government and civil society concerns. In doing so, UNODC brings a unique criminal justice approach. As the guardian of the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, we have ready-made legal framework for international cooperation and the prevention of human trafficking. Thanks to the convention, police no longer have to stop at frontiers, while criminals cross them frequently. We should also not forget how human trafficking is related to instability. When social and political upheaval exists, as in North Africa at present, our work is even more important in such turbulent and disordered regions. Trafficking in human beings is one of the most lucrative forms of organized crime, estimated to generate $32 billion in gross proceeds each year. Criminal assets arising from this grave violation of human rights and fundamental freedom may be invested in legitimate and criminal activities, challenging economic security and fueling corruption and undermining the rule of law. In a bid to answer these questions, UNODC has developed a database of human trafficking case law to provide immediate public access to officially documented instances of this crime. The database contains details of the nationals of victims and perpetrators, trafficking routes, verdicts, and other information related to prosecuted cases around the world. As such, it provides not only statistics on the number of prosecutions and convictions, but also the real-life stories of trafficked persons as documented in the courts. A little over a year ago, the General Assembly passed by consensus the United Nations Global Plan of Action to combat trafficking in persons, promoted the universal ratification of the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime and the Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children, as well as other relevant international instruments that address trafficking in person, and reinforce the implementation of existing instruments against trafficking in person, and building on the relevant sub-regional, regional, and cross-regional mechanisms and initiatives. An important operationalization of the Global Plan of Action and another mechanism promoting the right to an effective remedy for victims of trafficking is the United Nations Voluntary Trust Fund for Victims of Trafficking in Person, especially women and children, launched last November in New York. The fund, managed by UNODC, provides humanitarian, legal, and financial aid to victims of trafficking in person through established channels of assistance, such as government, non-governmental organizations, and international organizations. I would like to conclude my statement, which is a little bit long. I would like to conclude the statement by thanking the U.S. government in supporting not only the actions of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, but the international community at large. We have an excellent cooperation with the Office of the Ambassador Luis C. De Baca, especially on human trafficking. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, and I actually read it before today as well, so
okay.
Thanks for the audience and for repeating it to me. A few quick questions, just on the role of the United States. How big a role does the United States play with the office, in particular with your operation? I mean, is it in terms of the funding and personnel and et cetera? I mean, how would you characterize the U.S.'s role today, and how important is it?
Well, in general, the U.S. government is one of the largest contributors to UNODC. Of course, it's contributing to support and implement projects that are addressing transnational organized crime in general. So I cannot tell you now how much of this money is going to projects related to human trafficking. Of course, the fact that there is a trust fund now that is not is managed by UNODC, but is a UN trust fund that is basically supporting actions mainly implemented by non-governmental organizations around the world, is a way of increasing the U.S. support to this kind of problem at multilateral level. So it's a relevant contribution, as I said, and is addressing transnational organized crime in general.
Now, when these organizations look to recruit, for lack of a better term, victims, what are the conditions, what are the underlying conditions that create fertile ground for that? What are the markers of a society that tell you that they're vulnerable to this sort of activity? Well,
in the United Nations Global Plan of Action Against Human Trafficking, there are somehow recognition of the basic elements that are somehow fostering human trafficking. And those are, of course, underdevelopment, poverty, and most recently we have been seeing that in countries that are also affected by instability due to political instability, due to transnational organized crime type of activities, in particular drug trafficking, also human trafficking is somehow increasing. I'm thinking about West Africa, for instance, as a region that is under attack by drug traffickers. And we have been seen how there is an increase of smuggling of migrants and human trafficking coming from that region. So to the traditional issues of underdevelopment and poverty, there is this new element of instability that organized crime organizations are also exploiting for increasing their human trafficking activities.
So when we look at source countries or source areas for victims, what you're basically looking at is a combination of a society where people don't see economic opportunities, deep poverty and despair, combined with a government that's either unwilling or unable to stop these predators from coming in and taking advantage of that.
Correct.
And then, so on that question of governments that are unwilling or unable to take care of it, how many of them have been, I mean, you can identify them if you want to, but how big a problem do we have of nations that don't want to do anything about this because the transnational entities have corrupted the government and have basically allowed them to, or gotten them to look the other way?
Well, as I said, the protocol to the Palermo Convention is the most powerful tool that the international community has available for pushing those governments that are not responsive or are not doing enough to do something. 146 countries are parties to the protocol, but of course being part doesn't mean that the protocol is fully implemented, and the countries that are somehow trying to cooperate on this issue could also take advantage of the protocol itself. For instance, mutual legal assistance is one of the elements included in the protocol, and is always helping in cooperation, making a possible cooperation amongst countries on criminal justice aspect of human trafficking.
What I'm trying to figure out, and you, because of your global view on this, is how many, obviously I think we know that there are countries that would like, we have that tier system that our State Department uses. I think there are countries that would want to improve if they had the resources to do it, and obviously there are mechanisms in place to help them. Is there any evidence of a significant number of either national governments or local governments in these places that are in essence cooperating with the traffickers and with these organizations because they've been corrupted, because they're being paid off, because of some mutually beneficial arrangement? I mean, is that a significant part of the problem?
Is that, well, we are going to release a new human trafficking report in 2012. The office is precisely working on this study, so all those elements will be highlighted in the new study. And we are also working on the new UNODC Global Threat Assessment, which is trying to highlight how organized crime and all its forms are somehow affecting the stability of countries. Of course, there is a link between instability, corruption, and the inability of countries and governments to properly address this issue. Corruption is not only fueling human trafficking as an activities of the International Organized Crime Organization. It's also fueling instability, and as I said, I'm always referring to West Africa because it's the most evident example of how corruption and generated by transnational organized crime is really basically failing governance of the countries. So,
and this is probably another question for some other advocates as well, but what I want to ask, I guess, is are there any jurisdictions in the world, cities or countries, that are basically known, that we know are tolerating this or maybe even encouraging it, in essence, are sending out the message that this is the place to come to find victims, or this is the place to come to participate in these acts, particularly when it comes to sexual exploitation? Are there any countries in the world that are generally regarded as places where this is tolerated and maybe even encouraged as either a source or as a destination?
There are. But
I find them. Like, who would? Maybe you don't want to tell me, but how do I?
Maybe if you read the report of the U.S. government on this issue, you can find some.
Okay.
But as the UN, we are not really pointing the finger toward one country or another. We are looking more at the regional level, this phenomenon from the regional point of view, and the root of traffickers. So there are.
The last question is, I would imagine that awareness is a big. If most people knew that what they were being recruited in, not most people, if anyone knew that they were being recruited into slavery, be it forced labor or sexual exploitation, they wouldn't go. So obviously they're being deceived. In addition, as a society, if people knew the signs of this, people would understand it, would recognize it, and call it out. And I think that's true for some governments, that if they had the ability to recognize this stuff or were sensitive to it. A lot of this is just an issue of awareness. It's hard to believe that this is happening. It's hard for people to accept that. Well, how much of a challenge is that awareness aspect of it around the world? Clearly, in a society like the one that you live in or I live in, with massive number of communications, operations, news 24 hours, multiple newspapers, more news than you ever want or need, it's one way to create awareness for these issues. But I would imagine, especially in many of these source countries, the fact that this even exists is hard to disseminate and hard to explain to people. I mean, is that an accurate assessment? And what strategies are there in place to overcome that?
At multilateral level, well, first of all, awareness is essential. And raising visibility around this issue is even more important, especially in countries of source. At multilateral level, we are running a global campaign called the Blue Heart Campaign, which is somehow raising visibility and also bringing to the potential victims what are their rights and how they can somehow avoid certain situation or detect in advance being in certain situations that are then leading them to be victims of human trafficking. So in any of the UNODC projects that are addressing human trafficking around the world, there is also a component on awareness, especially in the country of Africa and especially for projects implemented also in Southeast Asia. So is there, but somehow the message sometimes is well received, sometimes is not received. So there is a huge effort that should still be done on this issue.
Thank you very much for your work and for your testimony. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
And I think our last witness today is Ms. Martina Vandenberg, who's the Council for Freedom Network, USA. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Senator Rubio, it's an honor to appear before you today. I would like to start by thanking you for your leadership in this area in human trafficking, particularly your work on the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act. It's an honor to appear this morning before the Helsinki Commission, and I appreciate this invitation today to testify. You and Chairman Smith have been particularly strong in your fight against all forms of human trafficking, not just trafficking for forced prostitution, and that is very, very much appreciated by the organizations in the advocacy community. I was particularly heartened to see the hearing before this committee in May on forced labor. Over the years, the Helsinki Commission has steadfastly fought to keep the focus on the victims of human trafficking. And that's that perspective that I hope to bring to you today. I lived in Russia for 4 years in the fight against violence against women and trafficking, and my favorite word that I learned in Russia was konkretno, so I'll be very concrete today. I've spent 17 years in the fight against human trafficking, both as an activist and as an attorney. I currently serve as pro bono counsel to the Freedom Network USA, which is a coalition of 31 non-governmental organizations and leaders providing services to and advocating for the rights of trafficking survivors here in the United States. The Freedom Network was created in 2001, immediately following the enactment of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. I've submitted lengthy testimony for this hearing, and I'd ask that that lengthy testimony be placed in the record, but I've changed my comments to fit the time allotted this morning, and I'd just like to highlight 3 organized crime trends that have been identified by advocates in the field, and also 3 strategies for combating this grave human rights violation. And then finally, I'll provide some concrete recommendations to the Commission. So trend number 1 that I'd like to focus on is that human trafficking is not only organized crime, it's what we might call disorganized crime. Often today in the United States, we see human trafficking conducted by small groups operating independently. In the words of Flory Burke, a Freedom Network leader and one of the leading experts on human trafficking in the United States, quote, "We are seeing more family-run operations and small criminal networks. It is not the old definition of organized crime, but it is just as dangerous." Take the Querétaro case, for example. In 2008, a diminutive grandmother from Mexico pled guilty to sex trafficking for her role in a family-run gang based in Tenancingo, Mexico. According to the indictment, 2 of Ms. Querétaro's sons and an associate used, quote, "physical violence, sexual assault, threats of harm, deception, false promises, and coercion" to force the women into forced prostitution in the United States. The traffickers brought impoverished women from Mexico, women and girls. They did so for more than a decade before they were stopped by the Department of Justice. And in some cases, the traffickers approached the young women in their villages and claimed that they had fallen in love with them, tricked the women, in some cases impregnated them, and then held the children back in Mexico as essentially hostages. These organized groups are small and opportunistic, and they can be incredibly brutal. But that said, they don't have to rely on extreme violence. Often the threat of arrest, detention, and deportation by U.S. law enforcement is enough to hold victims in servitude. Threats to family members, and especially to children in the country of origin, often compel the victim's compliance. So let me move to the second trend that we've seen in the field. Trend 2, where are the prosecutions? According to the State Department's Trafficking in Persons report, in 2010, there were just 6,017 prosecutions and 3,619 convictions. Those aren't statistics for the United States. Those are statistics for the entire world. In the United States in the same year, 2010, there were just 103 federal prosecutions of 181 defendants with 141 convictions. Now, in light of the State Department's own estimate that there are between 14,500 and 17,500 trafficking victims brought into the United States for forced labor and forced prostitution every year, 103 prosecutions is appallingly low. In Europe in 2010, there were 2,803 prosecutions, resulting in 1,850 convictions. Again, these numbers should give us pause because they indicate that traffickers, whether they are members of international criminal enterprises or syndicates, or solo practitioners, like so many of the traffickers I have sued as a pro bono attorney here in the United States, families, husbands, wives, diplomats who have brought individuals into the United States and held them in forced labor. These individuals enjoy near complete impunity, and only a tiny fraction of the prosecutions and convictions that have taken place have been for forced labor. Prosecutors are focusing on low-hanging fruit. They are bringing prosecutions for sex trafficking. In Europe, for example, of that enormous number, 2,803 prosecutions, only 47 were for forced labor. The rest were for forced prostitution, trafficking for forced prostitution. So let me turn now to trend number 3, which is organized crime feeds on corruption. Corruption is absolutely essential to traffickers' success. I have testified before this commission in the past about the concrete cases of corruption that my colleagues and I at Human Rights Watch documented in Bosnia and Herzegovina. As reported in the Human Rights Watch publication, Hopes Betrayed, Trafficking of Women and Girls to Post-Conflict Bosnia and Herzegovina for Forced Prostitution, corrupt police officers participated directly in human trafficking. Some of the police officers moonlighted as guards in brothels holding trafficked women, helping to enforce their enslavement. Traffickers provided payoffs to local police in the form of cash and free sexual services from the trafficked women themselves. This was all in exchange for protection from raids. Every time there was going to be a raid, the brothel owner would get a call and a warning. The International Police Task Force would arrive on the scene and the women would all be holding their passports. They had been instructed on exactly what to say. All of this was made possible through official corruption. Corruption and organized crime, and indeed those organized criminals engaged in trafficking, have a symbiotic relationship. And yet, corruption is one of the most underreported elements of human trafficking. But for the victims, it is one of the most fundamental elements. Because corruption is the backdrop to all of the trafficking-related exploitation that they experience in the United States. The women and children and men who are trafficked into the United States fear that police officers are simply in cahoots, in business with the traffickers, that judges can easily be bought off, and that prosecutors would never zealously prosecute a trafficker. These beliefs are common among the victims that we confront every day at the Freedom Network, at the member organizations. Many of the people we deal with, many of the victims, come from countries where corruption is utterly rife, and they assume that the United States is no different. Indeed, that's what the traffickers have told them. The traffickers have told them time and time again that once they are captured by U.S. law enforcement, they'll be detained, they will be prosecuted, they will be deported. Some have been told that they will disappear. For many of our clients, a so-called rescue by Immigration and Customs Enforcement is not a rescue. For them, it is the culmination of all the horror stories that they have been told by the traffickers. It is, in their eyes, an arrest. Victims from countries where justice is bought and sold on a daily basis see little hope of escape. They see little hope of justice. They see little hope of prosecution. The traffickers stoke and exploit these fears, telling them that the police are actually on their side, that the police will help the traffickers. This corruption silences the victims, and it guarantees impunity. So let's turn now to the strategies. The second portion of the hearing is strategies for combating human trafficking. So strategy one, and this is essential, protect the victims and the witnesses. Trafficked men, women, and children arrive on the Freedom Network member organizations' doorsteps in very different ways. Some have come through Good Samaritans, some have come through law enforcement, others have find our organizations through faith-based communities. But no matter how they find the Freedom Network member organizations, these victims have several things in common. First, they are highly traumatized. Second, they are utterly terrified. And third, they are concerned most about their family members back home in the country of origin, particularly their children. A victim of trafficking who is not safe cannot cooperate. In the face of threats from the traffickers, she cannot testify against the trafficker. Now, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act provides tools to protect the victims, but these tools are grossly underused. One of the key building blocks here in the United States is called continued presence. It's a temporary form of immigration relief available only through an application by a federal law enforcement officer. Continued presence, or CP, permits victims of trafficking to remain in the United States during a criminal investigation without fear of deportation. But the number of victims receiving continued presence in the United States has utterly plummeted. According to the State Department Trafficking in Persons report in June 2011, 299 victims received this very basic form of protection in 2009. But in 2010, that number dropped to 186. It is not only victims of trafficking who need protection, it is indeed their families. In the Corretto case, the forced prostitution case that I mentioned earlier, the traffickers, in fact, the grandmothers, the mothers of the actual traffickers operating in the United States, held the victims' children hostage. According to Suzanne Tumatora, an attorney and co-chair of the Freedom Network, Russian traffickers currently operating in New York routinely terrify their victims by bragging about links to organized crime back in the Russian Federation. Family members, these women are told, will not be safe unless they continue to work in strip clubs, they continue surrendering all of their earnings. So these cases, I think, speak very poignantly to the need to protect not just victims in the United States, where I would argue we are falling down on the job, but also their family members abroad. Family members should be paroled into the United States. The categories for derivative status, because again, trafficking victims can get special visas known as T visas, and their relatives, their very close relatives, can get T derivative visas. Those lists, those categories of individuals who are able to get T derivative visas should be expanded. Now, strategy number two, and this has been raised, I think, in the prior testimony, watch not just the illegal immigration streams, but the legal immigration streams. and in particular, watch the foreign labor recruiting organizations. Traffickers are enormously clever. They are very, what the Russians would call gibka, which is flexible. They can adapt quickly. Consider the case of Askar Khojayev, an Uzbek national. Now, Mr. Andres has already told you a bit about this case, so let me just fill in a few of the details. This Uzbek citizen and his co-conspirators lived in Kansas City. According to the 90-page indictment in this first case as a RICO criminal case against a foreign labor recruiter, according to the 90-page indictment, the traffickers charged their victims between $3,000 and $5,000 to obtain temporary H-2B visas, employment visas to work temporarily in the United States. The victims and their families borrowed heavily to pay these enormous fees. They were told, however, by the traffickers that if they left the exploitative labor conditions that they were held in 14 states in the United States, and if they returned home, their families would have to pay an additional $5,000. The traffickers not only did not pay them wages, did not pay them overtime, but put them in apartment buildings, told them they had to live there, charged them astronomical rents, and when the victims actually did occasionally get a paycheck, sometimes that paycheck was for negative earnings because they owed the traffickers so much money. Now, in that case, there was a guilty plea, which brings me to the next point, another strategy for fighting human trafficking. Grab the money. Under U.S. law, restitution for trafficking victims is mandatory. That's 18 U.S.C. 1593, part of the TVPA. That's the law. But the reality that the advocates see in the field is quite different. In the experience of Freedom Network members, restitution orders are rarely collected. In some cases, the seized assets go directly to government coffers. In other cases, the U.S. Attorney's Office does not enforce the restitution orders aggressively. Restitution orders must be enforced, and in the first instance, it is the federal government's responsibility to do so. Now, why? Why does restitution matter? As we've all heard today, human trafficking is highly, highly lucrative, and seizing criminals' assets to some extent will deter their crime. Enforcing restitutions renders trafficking slightly less lucrative. And second, trafficking victims are owed these funds. This is money that was stolen from them. When asked several years ago how much restitution was actually ever distributed to the victims, the Department of Justice just responded that they didn't collect these statistics. The Department of Justice should track the amounts of restitution, not just ordered by the courts, but the actual amount of restitution that's collected. There is no higher use for organized crime's ill-gotten gains than the restoration of the victims. So we need a scorecard. How much was ordered? How much collected? I have a host of recommendations, but I will just highlight a few this morning. First is increase the use of continued presence. The Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act had a section on lowering the standards slightly for continued presence. It is important to do so that law enforcement will use this tool to protect victims. Increase the categories available for T visa derivative status to permit more family members to come into the United States. Ensure that trafficking victims are not held in immigration detention, because some are. Increase the attention in the State Department's Trafficking in Persons report to the role of corruption in human trafficking. This should include trafficking by state officials, including a focus on diplomats trafficking domestic workers for forced labor to the United States and around the world. Include fraud and foreign labor contracting as a RICO predicate act. As you've heard today, we see much fraud and foreign labor recruiting, and that is one of the main methods used today by traffickers. And then finally, request a Government Accountability Office study on the collection of criminal restitution orders in human trafficking cases. So I will leave it at that. I appreciate your concern and your focus on this issue, and I'm happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you. And what I want to focus today on my questions with you on is mostly the U.S. aspect of it, and here's why. Not because the global one isn't. It's very important. I think in order for us to have credibility on this issue globally, as policymakers, as a government, as members of this commission, we have to say that we ourselves are employing the best practices. You have to hold yourself up to that standard, and you have to lead by example. And I think we should never underestimate what a powerful example America can be. So what I want to explore with you a little bit is what you talked about, the legal immigration streams. My guess is that, and really let's explore the forced labor aspect of it. Not that the sex trafficking is not egregious and outrageous. It is, and we should focus on that as well. And it's probably coming through some of the same streams. But I think the one that correct me if I'm wrong, but the one that probably gets less attention, but is a big problem nonetheless, is the forced labor one, because it can get nebulous. So my first question is, walk me through a little bit of what a typical, I would imagine the majority of these people that are in forced labor actually enter legally through one of these foreign worker programs. Walk me through what that experience is like for the trafficked person. You are, you know, in a society where somehow someone reaches out to you and says there's jobs available in the United States, this is how much they will pay. I mean, walk us through how that works and how they navigate the existing legal immigration process to bring people here.
I can give you two examples. One is right here in Washington, D.C. It's a case that I brought against a Tanzanian diplomat.
And it's typical, except for the diplomat part, which is that pretty prevalent, the diplomat?
No, in Washington, D.C. and surrounds, we see a large number of cases of trafficking by diplomats. So in this particular case, the diplomat in Tanzania recruited a young woman to come to the United States and serve as a nanny, got her a visa, an A3 visa, a visa reserved for diplomats to bring over domestic workers to the United States. When she arrived in the United States, according to the complaint that we filed and according to testimony that she actually gave before the House Foreign Affairs Committee, he refused to pay her. He took her passport away and forced her to work 17 hours a day for free. She was not allowed to leave the house. She was cut off from her family entirely. Because her visa, that A3 visa, was completely bound to her employer, the moment she walked out the employer's door, she was out of status. That is one of the things in all of these visa schemes that makes it so frightening for the victims. They understand that if they leave the trafficker, they are immediately in undocumented status. Now, the other case I want to highlight is, again, this Uzbek trafficking case. We call it the Giant Labor Solutions case. In this particular case, and again, the defendant, Askar Bojayev, pled guilty in this case and was sentenced to 12 years. The scheme there, according to the criminal indictment, was to find individuals already in the country with legal visas, whether they be J1s or other B1, B2, other visa status, and tell them, okay, we can get you an H-2B visa. And then they would file false statements to the Department of Labor to try and get a certification, because in order to bring someone in on an H-2B visa, you don't necessarily need a name. You don't need the name of the immigrant. What you need are a number of slots. And you need a labor certification stating that you can't find U.S. domestic workers willing to fill those slots. And so the indictment actually covered the failure to first, fraudulent submissions made to the Department of Labor indicating that there were companies that needed these slots. And then also the indictment covered the traffickers switching, if you will, when the individuals came in on these H-2 visas, T2B visas, or when they received H-2B visas, they were not put in the slots, they were not put in the jobs that had been certified by the Department of Labor. They were moved all around the country and put in different billets. So from the perspective of the victim, and I've seen this in many of the pro bono cases that we have brought on behalf of victims, from the perspective of the victim, he or she believes that he or she is coming to the United States legally. He or she will make significant amounts of money, certainly enough to pay off the labor recruiter or to pay off all the debts that they've incurred at home and that the family has incurred at home. And they believe that they will have a normal job, that they will be able to leave during the day after work, that they will still have their passport, that they'll earn a salary. And so the shock when they come here is that they are bound to the employer. Many times the employer takes their passport. They are held in squalid conditions. I had one case where a trafficking victim was forced to sleep on the kitchen floor like a dog. And they realize that if they leave, they risk being undocumented and they risk deportation. And they're terrified, particularly in this immigration environment in the United States.
Most of these victims are cut off from all information. I mean, do they have access to television? Do they have any time? Typically, do they have any access to any news or information?
They have two things. One, if they have come in the last few years since the 2008 reauthorization, the Department of State consular officials now give a brochure to every single individual coming to the United States on a work visa. And that brochure is,
in their native language?
It's not always in their native language. It's been translated by the Department of State into about 11 languages.
Okay.
That brochure, however, which I think is the product of one of the finest public-private partnerships I've seen under the Obama administration, the Department of State cooperated with the non-governmental organizations and together created this pamphlet. The pamphlet has the phone number on it for the national hotline. And so that National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline is listed on the brochure, and there have been literally thousands of calls that have been prompted by people having the brochure. Now, in my experience with the trafficking victims that I have represented in pro bono civil suits and from the cases that we've seen with Freedom Network members, the victims may be able to watch television to some extent, although in my experience, particularly with domestic workers, the moment they sit down to watch television, they're told to get up and start working, go iron the curtains. There's always some work that is created for them so that they don't have the opportunity to sit down. Their access to telephones is very limited. They're not generally allowed to call anyone. They're not generally allowed to have cell phones. And so that isolation makes it very difficult as well. I have seen cases where trafficking victims have come to the United States and have gone into debt to their employers who refuse to pay them and then charge them all sorts of fees. And literally, those folks have contacted their relatives in the country of origin to ask those relatives to send money to them in the United States. The entire point of migration by people who become trafficking victims is to come to the United States to earn money so that they can remit it home to their families and children.
This hotline that you have, has there been any effort to create public service announcements on news outlets that may reach your migrant communities?
There has, and Mary Ellison, who's from the Polaris Project, which actually runs the hotline, is here today. There is I think a provision in the current draft of the TVPRA to increase the amount of publicity for the hotline, and the hotline is now posted quite significantly around the country. So there have been a large number and a growing number of calls.
Who is it that runs the hotline?
Mary Ellison. Mary. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Hi. Just the follow-up that I would have is, I think one of the things we could and should explore is whether some of the national networks and local affiliates that particularly broadcast to, whether they're local stations or broadcast, say, the Spanish networks or that broadcast to migrant communities, would be willing to run public service announcements highlighting, this issue. And in particular, your rights. There are certain things that are not legal. If these things are happening to you, it's not normal, it's not legal, and this is a number you can call. Obviously, it leads us to
the Department of Homeland Security has actually created 2 public service announcements that are done both in English, and I think they're also available in Spanish, that they're planning to blast across the country. The one thing I would say about public service announcements is that it's very important to involve the non-governmental organizations in the creation and vetting of those public service announcements. We recently sent a letter to the Department of Homeland Security with exactly that point, because the non-governmental organizations have by far the greatest experience with victims of trafficking and a much better sense, I think, of what will bring the message home to them. Because I think you're dealing with this a lot, our existing visa programs, and obviously not to wade too far into another debate, which is politically problematic for a lot of people, but our existing visa programs in and of itself are bureaucratic, complicated, burdensome, difficult to navigate. To what extent is that utilized by traffickers? To what extent are they hiding behind it? They figured out how to maximize it, and to what extent would reforms to those programs be devastating? In essence, are there specific reforms to those programs that we should explore, and what are they to help make it harder for these trafficking operations to function? Ironically, it is the difficulty of getting into the United States, it is the difficulty of getting a U.S. visa that traffickers exploit, because you need someone to help you. People sometimes will go to individuals they think are smugglers to help smuggle them into the United States because of, again, the very fierce immigration regime that the United States has, only to learn that those smugglers aren't actually smugglers. Those smugglers are actually traffickers. But let me give you an example of how traffickers are so incredibly nuanced and subtle in their crimes. I recently met with Paul Fishman, who's the U.S. Attorney for New Jersey. And that office, the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Jersey, brought a very important case out of Newark. It was a case of 20 or so young girls brought from Togo and Ghana, brought to Newark, forced to work in hair braiding salons. They would spend 16, 17 hours a day braiding hair. They got to keep none of the money that they earned. They were abused, again, held in conditions of squalor by the traffickers. In that case, the question is, how did those young girls get here from Togo? How did they get here from Africa? The trafficker, who was actually a very well-respected businesswoman, realized that people who had won the green card lottery in Africa couldn't necessarily come to the United States, because even once you win the lottery, it costs quite a lot of money to facilitate all of the paperwork that you have to do. So she, a very experienced businesswoman, said, I will pay all those fees. I will help you with all the paperwork. All you have to do is bring in this young girl as your daughter. And so she paid off a number of individuals to bring in these children. The children were then turned over to the traffickers in the United States, part of the same network. And in this case, again, it was a family network, a wife, a husband, and her son, who ran the entire network, which over time earned about $4 million in proceeds. And when those children arrived in the United States, they were handed over to the network, and they were putting these hair braiding
Basically,
salons.
the complexity and expense associated with it creates an environment conducive for middlemen, and oftentimes the middlemen are traffickers who help you because they can front the money and help you navigate the complicated process, but once you're here, you're at their mercy.
That's exactly right. And once you're here, you may owe them money, and once you're here, you are constantly under the threat of deportation. Yeah.
On the you talked about how the CP process is not being used as often. Is there any reason that you've been told why that's the case, or do we know why? I mean, I'm sure there's an explanation. I don't know what it is, but
yeah, we have racked our brains on this one, and the NGOs have asked precisely this question, because as a representative, as an advocate and an attorney for trafficking survivors, whenever I go to the Department of Justice and my client submits to an interview with the FBI or ICE or the Department of Justice, we always ask for continued presence. It's always sort of one of the very first things on our agenda, so that the client is safe and can continue to cooperate. My feeling is that the problem is threefold. One, the standard is too high. Right now, the law enforcement authorities have to certify that someone is a victim of a severe form of trafficking. After one interview with a victim, it is very hard for a law enforcement officer to sign a declaration saying this person is a victim of human trafficking, and they're afraid to do so. The second is, I think that law enforcement personnel still need more training. I think they are still convinced, many of them, that trafficking requires snarling dogs, barbed wire, being chained to a radiator, and high levels of physical violence. And what we saw and what we see now with human trafficking is that that level of violence is unnecessary. Indeed, the entire creation of the forced labor statute in the 2000 TVPA, if you go back and look at the legislative history, the entire purpose for passing that statute was to in a sense, go past Kosminski, the League Supreme Court case on involuntary servitude, and to show that a far lesser degree, far more subtle forms of coercion, far more subtle threats against third parties, that all of those things are enough. The problem, I think, is that law enforcement is still looking for rapes, sexual assaults, and snarling dogs, and those things are not always present. I think the third problem is there's a conflation of two different standards. There's the standard for CP, and the standard for CP should be available even after just one interview with a victim. Hello. Steve Cohen. Hi, Commissioner Cohen. Welcome. Thank you. But the second standard is for T visas. When you file for a T visa, if you are lucky, and it doesn't happen very often, if you are lucky, you get what's called a SUP-B, an I-914 SUP-B, which is a certification by law enforcement that this is indeed a trafficking case. And I fear that law enforcement has confused these two standards. The standard for CP is much lower. It should be just that we have an investigation going on. The standard for a T visa is, this is a human trafficking case, and I certify that it is a crime. I fear that those are getting muddled.
My last question is the trafficking cases like the one you outlined from Ghana and other places, they have to have markers. There has to be certain markers to a typical case or to that raise a red flag. I would imagine two things. You correct me if I'm wrong. Number one is there are certain markers that you would see in a trafficking case that you wouldn't see in another clear-cut case, right? If someone's coming in to work at, I think there's got to be some, at an elementary initial level, an ability to differentiate between those that clearly look legitimate and those that have some markers to it. And the other is there's got to be some best practices. There's got to be organizations out there that we know are not traffickers and are involved in the process of recruiting foreign workers, and as opposed to those we've never heard of before or are new to the marketplace or et cetera. So for lack of a better term, we know what the routes are. We know where the places that people are coming through. We know what some of the markers are. Isn't there something to be said for again, for lack of a better term, profiling some of these cases, flagging them, understanding cases that bring 3 or 4 elements that at a minimum require an additional level of scrutiny? You talked about the diplomat case, for example. I imagine there are legitimate diplomats that are bringing people in and are really working and doing okay, and then there are others that maybe we've had bad experiences with in the past. Is there a role for that in the initial process, in the initial visa process of trying to, I don't know if the word is profile, but certainly identify cases that raise certain red flags and maybe at the front end would provide more scrutiny and follow-up? And I know a lot of that is a matter of resources.
So let me start with the diplomats. There are diplomats who are what I would call repeat offenders. These are diplomats who bring in domestic worker after domestic worker after domestic worker. And what happened to all of the other domestic workers before who ran away or who went home without warning is a mystery. So I think that the State Department should definitely be looking for what I would call serial domestic worker visas.
Find who they are. How do I get the name of those people?
Oh, call me.
Okay.
Yeah. But I think the State Department legal office actually, I think, has a sense. And because of the changes that you made in the 2008 TVPRA, that reauthorization, they are now required to track these things. And they are supposed at least to put red flags in the system so that individuals who are accused of exploitation on numerous occasions cannot get more visas, which is a good sign. In terms of the red flag and what we need to watch, I think you really put your finger on it when you said, our immigration scheme is complex and difficult, and you need a middleman. We need to be looking at the middlemen. We really need to be focusing on labor recruiters. And one of the things that has recently happened, and the representative from the Department of Labor who appeared before this commission in the May forced labor hearing talked about this a little bit. There are now regulations on the H-2A visas that indicate that you cannot, as a foreign labor recruiter, demand fees from the actual employees that you're bringing to the United States. Senator Cardin at that hearing asked a very important question, which is, how do you enforce that? How are you enforcing that? And so the non-governmental organizations and the Freedom Network advocates and others put forward a proposal for enhanced regulation of foreign labor recruiters. Again, the non-governmental organizations also put forward a proposal to make fraud and foreign labor recruiting a RICO predicate act so that criminal cases can be brought in these cases. It is highly troubling that there are labor recruiting agencies who are able to bring over not just hundreds but thousands of individuals who then find themselves in situations of exploitation in the United States. And let's be fair, not all of those situations of exploitation rise to the level of human trafficking, which is a high bar, but labor exploitation in the United States is rife. What I can say is that what I see, even with my clients, even with the victims of human trafficking I've represented pro bono, even with those individuals after they get T visas, and everything in the United States is supposed to be terrific, I have seen time and time again those victims end up with exploitative employers who do not pay them minimum wage, who do not pay them overtime when they work overtime. And that level of labor exploitation that occurs in the gray economy, even for people with legal visa status, is very, very problematic. So the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, have called for greater involvement by the Department of Labor and greater enforcement of labor exploitation laws generally, because that will change the playing field. If labor exploitation is focused upon, then trafficking will be also more difficult to commit, or at least noticed more frequently.
Thank you. I appreciate the work you do, and you do most of it pro bono, and you're to be commended and thanked by this Commission and by our government. But let me ask you about labor exploitation, and what fields is that mostly taking place in?
It's a wide variety of fields, and if you look at the cases that the Department of Justice has prosecuted and should get tremendous credit for prosecuting, they run the gamut from, as I mentioned, hair braiding salons in Newark, New Jersey, to nail salons all up and down the eastern seaboard, to agricultural labor in Florida, and harvesting of beans, hotel work, hospitality work. There was one particularly egregious case in South Dakota that was prosecuted by the Department of Justice, where a husband and wife team brought in a group of workers from the Philippines, some of them with master's degrees in hospitality, and told them that they would be sort of running a hotel. And when they arrived, they were basically forced to work around the clock, many of them doing housekeeping services in the hotel rooms. So it really runs the gamut. Most of the people that I represent in civil cases, including a RICO civil case that we brought in the Eastern District of Wisconsin against what we called a family criminal enterprise. Most of the people I represent are domestic workers.
Is there any corporation that we might know about that has some dirty little secret that labor exploitation that you would like to reveal at this time?
I'm going to take the UNODC approach to this and not name any names, but I would say that the organizations that are doing labor recruiting, and they are certainly known to the Department of State and to the Department of Homeland Security, those organizations need to be monitored to make sure that the visa applications and the Department of Labor certifications that they are submitting are accurate and not fraudulent. I will say that there are a number of companies that are now facing civil lawsuits. The Southern Poverty Law Center has brought a lawsuit on behalf, it's actually I think now been certified as a class action, brought on behalf of workers brought into the United States from India, including high-skilled workers like welders and other skilled builders in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. And so the Southern Poverty Law Center is now pursuing a lawsuit that's been written up in the New York Times on a number of occasions for allegations of trafficking those workers to work in Mississippi and the Gulf states.
When people hear about human trafficking, I think they normally think of sexual exploitation and bringing in from Eastern Europe or wherever. What percentage of the problem is indeed in that capacity as distinguished from ordinary labor?
You know, it's a very difficult question to answer, and the statistics on this are very problematic, but I would say that the best statistics on this are the International Labor Organization statistics. And the International Labor Organization has said that there are approximately 12.3 million people around the world who are held in forced labor. Now, the ILO's understanding of that is that of that some subset, 2.4 million, are held in conditions that they would consider trafficking. Now, when the International Labor Organization sort of breaks that down in terms of forced labor as opposed to forced prostitution, as opposed to sexual exploitation of children, I think the numbers get a little bit murkier there. And part of the reason is because in many of the forced labor cases that we have seen with the Freedom Network members, particularly forced labor cases involving children, it is not just forced labor. Many of the children are also sexually violated. So many of the children are raped and sexually abused when they're in the situations of forced labor. So it's a difficult question to answer, but I think Congressman Smith has said in the past, as have many others, that forced labor is actually the majority of trafficking that we see around the world, number one. Number two, it is what I always call the caboose of the human trafficking train, because it's the most forgotten, the most ignored, the least discussed. And third, it is the least prosecuted. I mentioned some statistics that, of the 2,803 prosecutions in Europe, 47 of them were for forced labor. And so there is this danger, I think, in law enforcement to go after the easy stuff. The easy stuff, in a sense, is forced prostitution and street prostitution. It's very easy to go after those cases. It's fairly obvious. It's our traditional view of of trafficking. As you say, it's the kind of trafficking that we read about in the newspaper. Forced labor is harder to find. It takes far more effort to find forced labor, and unfortunately that kind of effort is not being expended.
I did not have the opportunity to hear your opening statement, which I wish I could have, and I don't think it's in our books. And so you may have answered this already, but are there recommendations that you have for laws that need to be tweaked in our country?
I included in my remarks 12 recommendations. So
Keep me busy.
A host of recommendations. They're not all legislative. What I would say is the Freedom Network members have been making the rounds and meeting with many members, both of the House and the Senate, including Senator Rubio's staff, to talk about the Trafficking Victims Protection reauthorization that is up this year. And the members of the non-governmental organization communities really feel that this reauthorization is enormously important. So the current legislative ball that we have our eye on is the TVPRA and the importance of passing the TVPRA, which has some elements that we asked for and some elements that we did not, that we requested and did not get. So, for example, the CP changes to protect victims, those are in the House version, they're not in the Senate version. The foreign labor recruiting provisions that had been requested were in the House bill, but now have been stripped out. The Senate bill includes a request for a GAO study to look at foreign labor recruiting. So, at a minimum, I think the GAO study should go forward. But I think the NGO community feels very, very strongly that the TVPRA is sort of the most important piece of legislation that could pass in the near future.
Thank you very much for your time and for your work, and I appreciate it. And Senator Rubio, thank you for your time.
Thank you for your testimony. Thank you all for being here, and the commission is adjourned.